これが木の壁の向こうからやってきたデジモン。
なんだこいつ。Now, before I get into episode 53, I want to mention that in episode 52, we had a few odd scenes interspersed within the ongoing battle with Paimon. There we saw Genai and Centarmon overlooking two flaming geysers inside a cave. And as we're told, these flames are a literal firewall, a firewall being in reference to a computing system designed for network security. A lot of exposition is laid out here, setting up a final boss battle. Now, I didn't mention this scene in my analysis of episode 52 because it's awkwardly placed. I mean, you have the ongoing battle with Paimon, where tensions are supposed to be rising, and the children are fighting for their lives against the final Dark Master, and then all of a sudden we cut to Genai and Centarmon casually talking about this firewall and the prophecy. And need it be said that any mention of the prophecy is out of place at this point? We'd only recently established that the entire prophecy was false, right? And what was divulged in episode 45 was that the chosen children were selected by homeostasis to maintain balance in the digital world. During the same night that Greymon and Parrotmon fought each other on the streets of Odaiba, homeostasis had taken the opportunity to scan a number of the children in the real world. And that was the event that played out during the 1999 Digimon Adventure movie. And we aren't told very much about how homeostasis selection process actually worked, other than that the children selected just so happened to be present and visible during that time. What I mean is there were millions of other children around the world who would have boasted the kinds of traits that the children in Odaiba had, and would therefore have made them eligible for selection. But those children simply weren't in that particular place at that particular time. And concerning the prophecy, we still don't know anything about who wrote it, when it was written, and how long ago it was written. Does it even matter at this point? There were some hints dropped here and there, but nothing is substantial. And as I said in episode 45, homeostasis never really elaborated upon its details either. Anyway, the long and short of Genai and Centarmon's conversation is that a great evil has recently been able to breach this firewall and enter the digital world. Spiral Mountain's destruction, while a victory in its own right, only hails a new tearing of the fabric of the digital world, a rift that then draws the chosen children into the abyss. And as they arrive in this strange new realm, Koshiro makes contact with Genai again, who confirms that their ongoing fight against the forces of darkness has taken them to the source of all evil. According to Genai, this creature is so powerful that its very existence is what forced the digital world's inhabitants to reach out to the real world and summon the chosen children. Further revealed here is that this great evil had originally been locked away by another group of chosen children who existed before Taichi's group. However, the invention of a previous group of chosen children seems arbitrary. The existence of a previous group might have been an interesting detail if they had been hinted at earlier, or if the writers had stated or even implied that these children had actually died in their efforts to save the digital world. In fact, one may have very well assumed that they had died, since these children are never brought up again during the course of the Digimon Adventure series until Adventure Torai. That's right, Adventure 02 completely glosses over their existence. Moreover, concerning everything I just said about homeostasis induction of Taichi's group, the involvement of a pre-existing group of children actually runs contrary to that. Supplanting this idea, I'd have gone with what was theorized by Koshiro in episode 19. Let me explain. So in episode 19, Koshiro had stated the possibility that the bodies of the chosen children in the digital world existed separate from their bodies in the real world. He had said that perhaps their real-world bodies were asleep or in some kind of stasis, while their conscious minds were awake in the digital world.
This will feel a little weird.
Now, if I had been writing this, I'd have pushed this idea further by introducing the concept of snapshots. And for those unfamiliar, I'm not talking about photography here, but a computing term analogous to photography. A snapshot is a form of data backup. And the suggestion that I'm making here is that the data constructs in the digital world, Taichi and his friends, are actually digital copies based on the real-world children in Odaiba. What this idea entails is that the real children were never actually brought into the digital world in the first place. The real-world children were just used as a template to create digital copies.
Like how a camera snapshot captures an event at one point in time, a storage snapshot captures data at one point in time. Specifically, a storage snapshot is a set of reference markers for data at a particular point, acting like a table of contents. It's not an exact replica of data, but a quick picture of how data looked at that moment in time that users can roll back to.
思います。でもこの光は
皆さんのデータをスキャニングしているところです。
In other words, Taichi and his friends would still exist in the real world and go about their lives completely unaware that copies of them would be adventuring in the digital world. It's an idea that promises both interest and terror at the same time, given the kind of existential crisis such a prospect would hold. In such a conception, Taichi and his friends might discover they weren't the original copies, they were just the most recent versions. All versions, however, would have been based on a real-world template, updated as necessary in order to meet the demands of an ever-evolving digital world. And so imagine a scenario where the current versions of the children learn that there existed a set of copies that died in the past, but temporarily saved the digital world in the process. Moreover, what would their reaction be if they discovered that homeostasis had been left to create even more copies, improved copies, in preparation for future engagements with the forces of darkness? Furthermore, this would be how Nanamon was able to clone Sora. In mimicry of the technology used to create the digital chosen children, he would manage to create a knockoff Sora with which he planned to use in conjunction with Sora's Digivice or tag and crest. It's the kind of storyline that might have unraveled if, say, Nanamon had been allowed to become a more prominent antagonist of the series, but all of these ideas are best left told in a different story. For now, let's get off of this tangent, start talking about Apocalymon.
私を醜いと思うか。そうだろう。お前たちはそう思うだろう。所詮我々は進化の過程でその行く手を阻まれたもの。
From what we're told, Apocalymon is the darkness itself, a presence whose very existence has warped space-time and created all the distortions throughout the digital world and the real world alike. The only thing that stopped Apocalymon from completely enveloping either world was the existence of that wall of fire. However, that wall has now been breached, leaving the chosen children to face their final enemy within his very lair. Apocalymon isn't simply the surrounding abyss, however. He does have a physical form that steadily reveals itself to the children. Now, something of note here, and throughout my commentaries, is I haven't spoken much about the changes that were made between the original and English versions of the show. I wanted to focus more on the elements of the original story, in and of itself, but nevertheless I'll talk a bit about the English dub here, as that commentary will help support some of the things I'll say right now concerning Apocalymon and how he is illustrated. So for the English dub, a number of characters throughout the franchise were voiced by a man named Derek Stephen Prince. And as a side note, I have a lot of respect for Mr. Prince. By all accounts, he loves the franchise and has on a number of occasions gathered loyal fans of the anime to talk about the show and ask him questions. In Digimon Adventure, Prince does the voice of Piedmon and adds a distinct flavor to the character that, well, let's just let him describe it.
So as it relates to season 1, Piedmon, anybody remember Piedmon? Yeah. Okay. One of the scariest dark masters. That was a homage to Tim Curry as Frankenfurter from Rocky Horror Picture Show.
How about that?
So let's compare Prince's voice to that of Japanese voice actor Chikao Otsuka.
I'm not a sicko, I'm a collector, and these new items have such sentimental value to me. Ha!
そう、頑張ったご褒美に私のコレクションに加えてあげたのさ。
Otsuka-san would have been about 74 years old around the time Digimon Adventure was produced, and thus provides a voice that is surly, marked with age. Unlike Mr. Prince, who provided a very cartoonish homage, as he calls it, Otsuka played the character rather straightforward, and so in contrast with the flamboyance of Prince's voice, Otsuka's Paimon comes across as far more creepy in comparison. Now, I don't say this to degrade Prince's performance in the English version of the show. He makes Paimon appear far too much like a cartoon and far less like an old man encased in the trappings of a cartoon, if that makes any sense. Otsuka's portrayal of Paimon, on the other hand, adds a very tragic element to the character. He seems far more reserved in the Japanese version, almost like he truly is a grown adult unironically wearing a clown costume, even as he exercises his cruelty. In the Japanese version, one gets a keen sense that Paimon truly is a mockery of maturation, which, as I've said, is part of the coming-of-age theme. And the whole reason I'm speaking of Paimon right now is because, coincidentally, Otsuka would also lend his voice to Apocalymon, and many of the themes attributed to Paimon may also be attributed to Apocalymon as well. Note this is wholly and utterly a facet of the original version of the show, as I said.
Ultimate evil, complete with hot and cold running water. Wait a minute, what am I laughing at? I'm supposed to be depressed. Always save your receipts. The warranty was probably still good on those things. Why do all of you get the pizza while I get the crust?
Oh, I can't take all these metaphors!
But in the Japanese version, one is given a sense of fear, pity, and disgust for what Apocalymon is.
我々が冷たく悲しく闇から闇へと葬られていくとき、その片方で光の中で楽しく笑いながら時を過ごしていくお前たちがいる。なぜだ!
Otsuka lends his voice to a creature that is ancient, bitter, and enraged.
我々が何をしたというのだ! なぜお前たちが笑い、我々が泣かなければならないのだ!
So Apocalymon first reveals itself in the form of an ominous decahedron. This prism sprouts several claw-like extensions, attached by chains that resemble DNA strands. And the chains represent much of what Apocalymon is, the refused strains of Digimon that disappeared in the evolution process. Meanwhile, the decahedron resembles the morphological structure of a virus, as indeed Apocalymon is a virus of magnanimous proportions. From one area, however, the symmetry of the decahedron is broken. An aperture appears from which protrudes the torso of some humanoid creature. This creature greatly resembles Devimon, and therefore functions as a callback to the original evil that the children had encountered on File Island. The visage of this torso is disgusting to behold, and appropriately so. Attached to the larger decahedron by a series of fleshy tendrils and tubes, the torso appears to be anchored to some kind of elaborate life support system. An exaggerated picture of, say, a hospitalized patient sick in bed. Thematically, this may be tied to Hikari's propensity to become ill. And an interesting detail which I have mentioned before about Hikari's illness was the fact that she was the only child who could be possessed by homeostasis. And as we know, homeostasis also refers to the state in which the body maintains a sense of normalcy. And so even as homeostasis maintains a state of balance in the digital world, Apocalymon is an opposing force, a malady, a virus. He is sickness incarnate. Now, there was a recent comment on my channel that suggested Apocalymon may also represent the Y2K problem, or junk data. And true, he may very well symbolize those aspects, and yet there's an onus to explain what those aspects mean to us, the audience, in the grand scheme of things of us watching this story unfold. Remember that computers are not natural objects, they are built by people, and as I mentioned in the Mugendramon section of the Dark Masters arc, technology has no purpose outside being acted upon by people. In this manner, a Y2K bug, or even junk data, are ultimately human flaws within human creations. As perfect as we'd prefer to assume our man-made systems are, they are flawed, and they remind us that we too are flawed. And indeed, while that may be a route of analysis worth exploring, I believe Apocalymon represents something more, something deep-seated. The image of this upper body locked in place hails back to classic depictions of Satan imprisoned within the depths of hell. As derived from the illustrations in Dante's Inferno, Lucifer himself is chained in place, and his lower half is embedded in a sheet of ice, trapped and made to suffer eternally. So too does Apocalymon speak collectively, as if he is more than one creature. This pattern of speech could be a reference to the Hebrew Bible and the demonic host named Legion, whom Jesus drove from a possessed man. Although Apocalymon may appear as a singular entity, he is in fact the collective embodiment of all the Digimon who were, in his words, thwarted through the evolution process. The Digimon Analyzer remarks that Apocalymon may even defy the Digimon classification given what he is, or rather, given what it is. Of further interest, however, is that aside from the protruding torso, Apocalymon does have an intricate and symmetrical design, not at all what one would expect a creature of chaos to look like. Although Genai mentioned that the void itself is Apocalymon, the decahedron is the incarnation of his body, formed from an otherwise formless void. Now why would that be significant? Well, consider what Koshiro says in response to Apocalymons mentioning that some species do indeed disappear during the evolution process. Of course, what Koshiro is referring to is the natural selection theory, that evolution is based upon a biological process wherein individual organisms with favorable traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, while weaker organisms will simply die out. This is the first time Digimon Adventure has ever formally laid out a philosophical underpinning to anything going on. Most of my analyses are done based on what is illustrated through thematic imagery, but here there's a direct commentary to glean from. Natural selection is often thought of from the standpoint of modern science. However, philosophically, it's a concept that has been around since the classic era, and the underlying idea is that order is derived from chaos. You see, if you consider the Big Bang Theory, the idea that an explosion of global magnitude was necessary for the spontaneous generation of life on Earth, that would lead to the underlying philosophical conclusion that only through destruction can form arise. The paradox is that life, or order, can only come as a result of chaos. This is significant here because Apocalymmon's formless void manifests itself as the decahedron, order arising from chaos. As such, the decahedron is like an island amidst a black ocean. And of course, when the children first arrived in the digital world, where did they land? Upon an island, isolated, surrounded by a vast ocean, order amidst chaos. It's the kind of thing that's also classically remarked upon in such tales as Homer's Odyssey, adventures on a boat at sea. And File Island would be no exception to this theme. It's a primordial microcosm, a kind of petri dish, so to speak, mixing several distinct environments into one, and also appropriately serving as the birthplace of all the digital monsters. And if you want a real-world analogy that remarks upon this theme, think of Japan and all its islands crisscrossed by a number of crustal faults in the earth. Throughout history, many parts of the country have experienced devastating earthquakes and tidal waves. Tsunamis illustrate the capacity of the Earth's oceans and seas to unleash devastation upon the world, destroying civilizations, and thereby throwing order and structure into absolute chaos. And in the wake of a tsunami, one would walk away with the idea that any semblance of order and structure within the world must be a rare and unnatural thing. And so what of the primacy of chaos? Often in storytelling, the forces of chaos represent evil arrayed against the forces of order, the good guys, the heroes of the story. Yet I contend that this scenario has been flipped on its head in Digimon Adventure. The true agents of chaos in this story are in fact the chosen children themselves. They are the anomaly working to undermine the foundations of order enacted by the powers of evil. Consider Mugendramon and the ironic state of his amalgamated city, or even the Dark Master's construction of Spiral Mountain itself. Despite the despotic dispositions of the Dark Masters, the four of them did indeed construct some form of order amidst the chaos of the digital world. Mugendramon's realm serves as primary example of form imposed upon the formless. Moreover, in its own twisted fashion, Spiral Mountain was also a picture of order out of chaos. Yet what happens to both of these is that the chosen children arrive and unravel Spiral Mountain by destroying its overseers. The Big Bang Theory presupposes that the world itself took form as a result of a spontaneous explosion, and under such a theory the Earth need not owe its intricate design to any intelligent hand, neither would humanity. But that is the audacity of Mugendramon's great city, all of its magnificence due human design, yet governed by an entity who owes no allegiance to humanity. In fact, Mugendramon's will is set against humanity in the form of the chosen children. His will is to kill them. In this manner, the Dark Master's war against the chosen children is a picture of rebellion against God. For what are the chosen children to the digital world but godlike beings from another realm, granted holy relics and given the power over evolution? Like the Tower of Babel in the Hebrew Bible, Spiral Mountain was built by rebellious beings, those in conflict with God, or in the case of the digital world, homeostasis. However, just like the Tower of Babel, the Dark Masters were also in conflict with one another. Incapable of cooperation, they were set apart. None aided the other in the ongoing battle against the Chosen Children, and so one by one they were picked off. Remember too Devimon's own fear of the Chosen Children. He was utterly reluctant to engage them in combat because he knew they held power that could destroy him, and yet, in his hubris, he was also overcome. The children are not made out to be anything special. Sure, there was some prophecy that they heard of, and they are referred to as the Chosen Children, of course, but coming from homeostasis in episode 45, the children really were just cherry-picked from Odaiba during the Greymon-Parrotmon battle. Otherwise, Taichi and his friends are really just 8 regular young people who were pulled into an alien world and told to partake in a conflict in which they had no personal stake or say. Digimon Adventure isn't a show about heroes, it's a show that undermines the whole idea of what a hero is. In fact, the incarnation of a hero was most obviously seen through Taichi, as Taichi repeatedly tried to embody the archetype, yet that was dismantled. What happens throughout the show is that he is humbled again and again. He can't win on his own. And above every other instance, we saw this in the Mugendramon section of the Dark Master's arc. We saw how weak and defenseless Taichi was against his new enemy. And yet he's saved not by any act of heroism on his part, but by the strength of his sister. Hikari Yagami, the youngest and weakest of all the children, even in her sickness, became the primary opposing force against the likes of Mugendramon, whose power was thought to have been infinite, without peer, and absolutely unbeatable. And so the weakest of us is the strongest of us. What's being illustrated here is a type of Christian hero. It's a hero who is not a mighty, conquering warrior, but one that is humble and meek, much like Christ himself. And with regard to all of this, one better understands Apocalymons protesting his fate here. In a grand paradox, Apocalymon insists that he is the true victim here, never mind all the evil he has wrought throughout the digital and the real world. In his words, he comprises all the resentment and all the hatred built up by all the Digimon who disappeared during the evolution process. He remarks on his jealousy of the children and their Digimon, enjoying the fruits of the digital world. And once again, this is in reference to him being of satanic origin. For so too does Jesus Christ make reference to those in hell, made to bear witness to those in heaven. A great chasm has been fixed between us and you, so that even those who wish cannot cross from here to you, nor can anyone cross from there to us. This is Apocalymon's eternal torment. In his dismay, he has been fixed upon this side of the gulf that separates the darkness of his abyss from the light beyond. And in gesture of his suffering, Apocalymon digs his claws into his arms, drawing his own blood. This was also censored by the English dub, yet serves a very poignant illustration. Apocalymon's torments are self-inflicted. At a glance, he is a victim of outrageous circumstances beyond his own control. He claims his being outcast is unjust, and that he was never given the chance to revel in the happiness beyond. All of that is a lie, however. Yet in his insanity, Apocalymon might very well believe in that lie. The kind of villain he represents here has been remarked upon in the past superbly by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who very brilliantly used the word resentment to describe a very real sentiment held by a great many people. Resentment is the French form of the English word resentment, but carrying with it the subtle undertones of a persistent hatred rooted in one's own impotence. What this all means is that Apocalymon is attempting to justify his evil deeds by assuming the role of a victim, and so he bleeds himself, clawing at his own arms. In this manner, even as the chosen children are supposed to represent Christ-like figures, Apocalymon himself is their antithesis. He is an antichrist. He is a mockery, an imitation of true suffering. And for Apocalymon, no better attribute can be applied than that term, resentment. And for his inability to reach the utopia beyond his realm, he lays blame not on himself, but on the chosen children and their Digimon partners. In a sense, he lays claim to having been victimized by them, as if his state of being is all their fault. Ironically, however, he regenerates from his self-inflicted wounds, revealing such a gesture to be insubstantial, hollow. He is less one victimized and more so one who has instead learned of the powerful possibilities of assuming the role of victim, and in turn he uses such power to inflict a new brand of suffering. Thus the oppressed has become the oppressor. In further mockery, Apocalymon sets his wrath upon the children and their Digimon, labeling his attacks as love, friendship, and justice. And even before the children can muster themselves to counter him, Apocalymon reaches out with his claws, enveloping the Digimon partners and then reversing the revolutions. Furthermore, in an effort to increase their disparity, he robs the children of their tags and crests, shattering them into 1,000 pieces. And so the children are left to scramble for options given their Digimon can no longer evolve. But Apocalymon has one last trick up his sleeve. Extending his arms outwards, he begins some mysterious chant, whose words I would love to have transcribed to make sense of, but I can't understand them. Nevertheless, this causes the children and their Digimon to be reduced to mere data particles. If one wonders why Apocalymon would not have just killed them outright, I've assumed that he simply wanted to cast them into another abyss, to have them float in oblivion and despair, in a similar manner as he had been made to. Yet the children and their Digimon remain, even as bits of data. Now here's a strange moment where one wonders how the chosen children and their Digimon even retain any cognitive abilities, given they're supposed to have been scattered into 1,000 pieces. And Taichi and the others even remark upon what had happened to them. Koshiro explains everything, although since this is a completely novel experience to all involved, it's a wonder how he even realized what they'd become. But getting back into thematic details, this area serves as a kind of limbo. World between worlds, where Taichi and his friends are given the opportunity to rally themselves for one final go at their greatest enemy. To use a sports metaphor, this entire sequence functions as one big huddle. The children and their Digimon take this time to recount their experiences, to reaffirm their bonds, and psych themselves for another go at their enemy. All in all, it's heartwarming and to the point. I think the only reason I dislike it is because maybe I'm too cynical. And that's me criticizing myself, by the way. I'm not criticizing the show for this. I probably should enjoy this sequence far more than I do, as corny as it may seem to me. But indeed, the show is drawing to a close, and here we're pushing a very cliched power of friendship trope out the door before we bring the final fight to an epic conclusion. And in this instance, I believe the show may very well have earned this moment. Once again, I'm saying this beyond my own desire that this kind of thing be played out in a far more subtle or casual manner. During the course of their adventures, we have seen the children stumble, fall, and rise again. It shouldn't surprise anyone that here we have what amounts to characters openly reaffirming the strength of their convictions and purpose, for such is the power of despair that it does cause one to question one's resolve. Appropriately, the crests that were destroyed by Apocalymon miraculously reappear, although emblazoned physically upon the bodies of each child now. The children have grown beyond the need of mere symbolic representation etched upon material objects. For who they are, their very identities have now been written upon their hearts, former hearts of stone replaced with hearts of flesh. Yamato includes a line here that goes a long way in explaining how the crests work, although the functionality wasn't entirely taken to extensive practice throughout the show. Specifically, and based on his dialogue, the crests don't just activate based on the individual attributes expressed by each respective child, but they also may activate based on how other children act upon the bearers. For instance, Yamato's crest activates upon his being a friend, or upon others being a friend to him. And likewise, Takeru's hope activates his own crest, or when others pin their hopes upon him. That might better explain how Anjumon was able to defeat Devimon, and furthermore how Hikari's crest had strengthened the powers of others in the past. So here's the reality. The show is drawing to a close. All of these last-minute revelations are being laid out because of that, even though it doesn't make much sense for Yamato or Koshiro, or anyone else for that matter, to just start saying, hey, I just realized how all this power works now. And the whole reason I harp about this point is because this is the difference between telling one's audience what to think and allowing them to think for themselves. This is a point I have and will continue to talk about in all of my analyses. A hallmark of good storytelling is when those writing a story know how to convey certain thoughts and feelings without having to tell their audiences how they're supposed to be thinking or feeling. And so generally speaking, the exposition here is not well written. And I'm not saying this because the scene is terrible, don't get me wrong. The symbolism is on point. What I'm trying to say here is that characters in a story should not just exist as life lesson generators, even in media made for children. In this story, Digimon Adventure contains enough information already to make such moments of exposition redundant in practice. The story has already played itself out. We've seen these characters grow accordingly. It's why this show is exceptional. It's why we love the characters in it. They are just regular kids stumbling about doing what they can to save two worlds. They're not supposed to be idealists working by the numbers to give audiences moral guidance. They're supposed to be real people. But, like I said, the show is almost over. The crest transference is a wonderful moment, truly significant. The symbolism speaks loud and clear as to what's going on. The journey and the hard-fought battle has all but come to an end. Episode 53 then closes out with a montage of all the Digimon partner evolutions. After that, the children and their Digimon rematerialize back to face Apocalymon in full force. No explanation is given for how they rematerialize, by the way, but at this point in the game, I suppose it's just as well this is a given. At best, one assumes that their lifting themselves from their despair is what restored them to their former selves. Moving into episode 54, the last episode of Digimon Adventure, we bear witness to the final battle. And it is spectacular to say the least. Each of the perfect level Digimon carves a path through Apocalmon's claws, making way for the War Greymon and Metal Garurumon combo to unleash its fury upon their adversary's main body. And the attack is successful. Apocalymon is then consumed in a barrage of fire and ice. Victory seems at hand, and yet the villain has one more card to play. An apocalypse in and of itself. The Decahedron then primes itself and detonates, threatening to doom everyone. But a miracle occurs wherein the resulting explosion is contained by the power of the Digivices. One assumes this explosion was also meant to be all-encompassing, that in his dying breath Apocalymon would have taken both the digital world and the real world down with him. But the Digivices form a cube around the explosion, each one set upon a corner, 8 corners, requiring 8 Digivices. Ultimately, this may have been the reason why 8 children were required to save the digital world in the first place. 8 children, 8 Digivices, 8 corners forming the cube used to contain the apocalypse. And thus both worlds have been saved. The face of the digital world disappears from the real world sky, to the grand relief of all onlookers from Tokyo and elsewhere. Shinkido, and indeed all the parents of all the chosen children, may rest assured. The mission has finally been brought to completion, and the adventure is soon to come to a bittersweet conclusion. So if you've found you enjoy this channel's content, please give the video a like and subscribe. Additionally, you may support me through Patreon, but I also take donations through Cash App. Think of it like a tip jar. The links for both can be found in this video's description. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for more.